Hello everyone and welcome to this Sporting Heritage Conference, Sporting Heritage and Education session. My name's Kate Fellows, I'm the Head of Learning and Access for Leeds Museums and Galleries. Welcome. We're all in Zoom webinar mode, so we can't see you, but you can see us. So please use the chat function to start introducing yourself, and if you see somebody you know on there, you can send them a private message. Because the beauty of a conference is often the networking around the side, so that's kind of what we want to foster in this session too. It's also going to be really important, the chat function, for asking questions to us, because we can't see you raise your hand, we can't see you waving madly at the screen. Just please put your questions in the chat, okay? Now the structure of this session is going to be, there's 3 presentations, one from Fran from Sporting Heritage, one from Derek, who's an educational consultant who's been working in the field for a number of years, and then, one from me. You've got to put up with a bit of me, and I will be chairing this session. Each one of those will be about 10 minutes long, and then we'll have a panel discussion, and then there'll be time for your questions at the end, because actually this session is about you getting the most out of it as possible. And for that reason, we will crack straight on, I suppose, and I'm going to hand over to Fran to introduce herself and then move on to her presentation, and then Derek will introduce himself afterwards, and then you get a bit more of me. Over to Fran.
Lovely, thanks Kate. So good afternoon everybody. It's quite strange being on this side of the Zoom, as for those of you who've been attending any of the rest of the conference, I've been sat in the background doing some of the tech admin support. So as Kate says, I work for Sporting Heritage, I'm part of the team here, but outside of Sporting Heritage, I'm a heritage consultant and have been working in the sector for 20 plus years, doing a range of jobs ranging from curatorial management to learning. But for the Sporting Heritage project, we have been working with the Yorkshire Cricket Foundation, and I'm going to just screen share so I can go to my presentation now. So you just bear with me. So yes, as I say, Sporting Heritage were commissioned by Yorkshire Cricket Foundation, who are based up at Headingley in Leeds, to work on a project that they've been funded through Heritage Fund. It's part of a larger project that they have had funding for. If I just click through to my next slide. So this all was commissioned pre-COVID. So we started our tender back in February. And the idea was to turn this project around between February and July, and obviously I'll come on to the things that have happened as the project has progressed, and then obviously the impact of COVID on the project. So this project is part of a wider range of activity for Heritage Fund. There's also a reminiscence strand that sits alongside the learning strand, which is essentially the school strand. As an organisation, Sporting Heritage were very aware that this was building on existing work that the foundation had been doing. They'd already run a pilot project, both in the reminiscence and the learning activity, and that it was very key to them introducing new audiences to cricket as a sport, but particularly cricketing heritage, of which there's a huge, rich amount in Yorkshire. It's very strong in its cricketing traditions. And one of the key things that underpinned this project was how to link some of the local grassroots clubs with their local communities. Everybody's aware of, you know, the national and the county teams, but there are actually probably about, well, more than 500 grassroots teams just in Yorkshire alone who were very active in their local communities. And one of the key things we wanted to deliver out of this project was a model that could then be replicated. This project itself is working with teams in Leeds and Bradford, but obviously I think the foundation would like to reflect on it when it comes to an end and see if they can replicate this model of working, of linking up their local clubs with their local schools in other areas across the country. So we were commissioned to put together resources that link to the Key Stage 2 and possibly lower Key Stage 3 curriculum. Also 3 assemblies presentations which are aimed at lower stage Key Stage 3, and then to use our network and our contacts to promote it to reach their key audiences, working in partnership with the foundation and with the clubs. So that was our brief. And again, just trying to emphasize, this was pre-COVID, so this was our plan, and everybody knows that plans don't always survive when they meet first contact with once you actually start to deliver. So this is what we plan to do. We were going to review the current activity. The foundation already have an active learning programme, and they'd also run a pilot project that underpinned this one. So we spent time looking at what had gone before. We were working with the foundation to establish our key partners. As I say, there's probably about 500, if not more, grassroots clubs across the county. We needed to pick out the key ones to work with in the Leeds of Bradford area, and we've ended up working with 16 clubs and one cricketing league. We had plans to publicise it, and I'll come back to that when we talk about the impact of COVID. And we wanted to build relationships. The foundation has a very good network of relationships with the clubs, but it's trying to build on that relationship so that the clubs can recognise that they can take on this learning activity should they wish to, and also raising the awareness within the schools. So once we'd looked at all that background research, we looked at how we would confirm the themes that would come up in the project. I undertook some desk research. I also went out to visit all the clubs and meet all the different people involved in the clubs and look at what material they had. I then spent most of the summer developing and designing resources, and we're just about to come on to finishing them off and uploading them to relevant spaces and publicise them. So that was the overall sort of arch of the project. Originally, as I said, we had between February and July to deliver, but we're still finishing off loose ends at the moment, and I'll come on to that when we talk about the delay. So what was overwhelming was how keen the clubs were to be involved. Everybody was keen. The whole project is managed by a chap called Chris Tasson at the foundation, and he'd done a great job of priming the clubs, and they were very keen to tell other people about the story of their club and the people who were involved in it. There was a fantastically rich history, both in individual stories, family stories, achievements of the club as a whole. But once we got into it, we realised that everybody was at a slightly different starting point. So some clubs had a fantastic knowledge of their history. Some were still researching their history. Some knew it was out there somewhere, but didn't know quite where to get hold of it. So everybody was at a slightly different starting point. And everybody had a slightly different understanding of the project. If you're not in regular contact with school or school-aged children, and having an understanding of what teachers could deliver in the classroom can sometimes seem like quite an abstract concept. So there was a little bit of time spent just trying to explain how we would use the heritage to turn it into a learning resource. Some clubs, as I say, weren't sure what they had. Some clubs were fantastically organised, had everything catalogued, listed, scanned, but there were quite a large number who weren't sure what they had, whether it was held in the clubhouse, whether it was held across a different number of people across the committee, whether it was just in a carrier bag tucked under a bench somewhere. So again, comes back to this idea that people were in different starting points and had different access. The other thing that was quite interesting as I started to talk to the clubs is what they deemed to be important about their heritage was not necessarily what I was looking for and what I was deeming important. So it's that idea of where you put that weight and store in your heritage. They were very keen to tell me how many cups they had won and more about the statistical side of the game, whereas I was very interested in the social history side that sort of underpinned all of that. Yes, we want to celebrate the great achievements that they've had, but actually it's those rich social stories that underpin it that I was looking for. So that took a little bit more teasing out. We got there in the end, but it was just that sort of the differences of expectations and understandings. So as I say, we started in February, brilliant timing for COVID. Luckily, I managed to fit in all my site visits to all the clubs before we went into lockdown. But obviously the impact of the lockdown meant we couldn't travel. The lockdown meant that obviously that from the end of March, nobody really wanted to go anywhere. So even those who lived very close to their clubhouses, if their collections were kept there, were nervous about travelling. A lot of people who I was dealing with were older and had underlying health issues, so automatically went into shielding. The knock-on effects for that meant that some collections became inaccessible. I was also hoping to access collections from the West Yorkshire Archive Service, so all the archives closed. So it meant that we had to sort of rethink how we were going to provide good quality collection material as the source or the inspiration for these. So what we ended up doing is I did a lot more desk research, and I did a lot more talking over the phone, and did quite a few Zoom chats actually with the club members. We were working with the teachers panel to pilot ideas and get a little bit of feedback, but obviously as soon as we went into lockdown and the homeschooling kicked in, and then obviously ready for the new term, their focus has been elsewhere. So we've been very aware that their time needed to be spent elsewhere. We'd also planned a fantastic launch event at Headingley for the summer term. Fantastic to bring a number of schools in to pilot resources in that great, you know, what better place to do it than at the Headingley ground, but unfortunately that hasn't been possible. So again, it's that sort of rejigging everything, which I think everybody who's been working on a project has had to do during the COVID period, and as the result the delivery of the project as a whole has been delayed. But luckily we were able to go back to the funder, which is the National Heritage Lottery Fund, and they have extended the project till the end of December. So we've been fortunate that obviously they've been very understanding in the situation. So I thought I'd tell you a little bit about the resources themselves. Because I come from a sort of a collections, I've got one foot in collections and one foot in learning, I was very keen that all the resources that we put together had to start with an item in the collections. It had to start with something physical. We couldn't start anywhere else. So all the resources are heavily embedded in their collections, and that meant where there weren't collections to support things, it wasn't possible to do it. So it's gone on our, these are things you might be able to look at next when you can find the material, because there's a great story here, but you really need to tie it in with your collections if you want to develop them in the same way that we have. So all our resources have the same structure. There's 2 sheets at the front of each resources. One has all the curriculum links on it, and then this is actually an example of one of the second sheets, which is a suggested activity structure. I know that teachers are experts in their field and don't necessarily need suggestions of how to do it, but this is just one way if you want to just pick it up and run with it straight away. Then each one has collection-based resources, and then each one has activity worksheets. So this is I'm going to talk you through some of the topics. So this is an example from some of the English resources. The picture that you can see, which is a menu card from Skipton Cricket Club, is part of a resource called Celebrating the Season, and it's encouraging the students to look at how the clubs celebrate their achievements, even in the years where maybe they haven't achieved as much as they maybe had hoped. And that idea of what's appropriate for a celebration, and also what you might do, what you might say. So they look at how to write a toast or a thank you speech as well. So our 3 English resources are Celebrating the Season, which is this one, as I say, about the menu cards and celebrations. Pen Your Own Poem, which looks at using cricketing language drawn across a number of the resources that have come from the clubs, doing an acrostic poem and a Kennings poem. And if you're not quite sure what those styles of poems are, the acrostic is the one where you put the word vertically and have a line that begins with each letter of the words, and a Kennings is a bit like a riddle. So they're very simple poetic forms that will be easy with a whole range of fantastic cricketing language. We've got a cricket in poetry pack, so there's 2 linked poem packs. The Pen Your Own Poem is the simpler one. The cricket in poetry one looks at identifying poetic devices in cricketing poetry, and we were lucky to have a number of poems that were brought forward by the club, and then a number of poems that linked to either Yorkshire cricket or Yorkshire cricketers. So we put them together as a resource pack and drawn out the local links. So they're the English resources. These are some of the maths resources. So we have 3 maths resources. So the one that you can see, Brilliant Batters and Bouncing Bowlers. This is looking at averages and means and medians in the maths curriculum, and it's using, as you can see there, a souvenir scorecard from a match of Menston Cricket Club versus North Leeds Cricket Club in the late 70s. It's got, I know the slide is not that dark, but you can see all the cricketing, batting and bowling scores. So it's looking at means and averages. Then the other 2 are variations on graph activities. One is looking at line graphs and one is looking at bar charts. So again, a sort of a simpler and a more complicated variation on graphs. So there are 3 maths resources. And then we have 3 topics for history. So this is an example of our First World War cricketing resource. And for anybody who's interested in the First World War and Yorkshire cricket, would recommend a fantastic book that talks all about the impact just on Yorkshire cricket. It's a fantastically well-researched piece. I will reference it when we publish the resources. So this looks at all different aspects of the war and how the cricket clubs helped and supported the war effort, how they lost men both to essential services at home and to the forces, and then how they sent out comforts, had charity matches, all those sorts of ideas. Obviously in the picture that you can see, you've got the Kitchener poster, which is well known, but the poster on the right is following a heavy bombing of Scarborough, which was very pertinent to Yorkshire. So the history topics are early in Victorian cricket, which looks at how a lot of the clubs were formed. We've got clubs being formed from 1820 onwards in the range of clubs that we're working with. So it sort of has got a little sort of late Georgian feel to it as well, but mainly around the Victorian formalisation of sport. And then there's a cricket resource pack that goes with that. We had so many fantastic resources that came in for the club of all the time periods that we looked at. The clubs had the best resources across their Victorian period. So we put it together as a separate pack so that you can do sort of a compare and contrast across them. Then there's the cricket in the First World War, and then there's a similar Second World War activity. Each of them has a comprehension activity that goes with it, and then each of them has a separate activity. So for the Victorian club, it's all trying to get the students to plan, if they were to set up their own sporting club, what would they do and how would they set it up? In the First World War pack, we do a conscience alley activity where the class have to take arguments for and against why cricket should have stopped or carried on being played during the war, and that's all based on the resource pack. And then in the Second World War one, we're doing a family history activity. So each one is quite rich and full. There are some topics that we weren't able to develop in the first main part of the project. We were, as part of the original brief, the foundation were very keen to develop a resource around women in cricket. And there are some fantastic stories out there, but this is one of the topics that the clubs weren't sure where the material was. So what would be great would be to follow that story of women cricketers from a lot of women played cricket in the early 19th century, and then as that Victorian morality kicked in, it became improper for them to be playing. But obviously it started again during the First World War and then had a bit of a heyday in the interwar years. And then you get into that tradition of cricketing teas, so that you can see sort of the role of women as they were playing cricket sort of ebbed and flowed. So there's some really fantastic stories out there, and obviously now women train to coach and to umpire as well as play. So there's more research to be done around that, and also looking at the Asian communities, particularly around the Bradford clubs. We need to just approach it in a slightly different way. So those 2 resources are still to be developed, and we're still working on our PSHE presentations, which are the key stage 3 ones, which are going to have the themes of standing on the shoulders of giants, so looking at how you build on your cricketing heritage tradition, overcoming adversity, and teamwork are going to be the 3 themes of those. Because of the delays due to COVID, there was a little bit of an underspend, and the foundation went back to the funder, and they've allowed us to repurpose some of the money. So some of the lessons learned that we've picked up during the project, and some of the things we weren't able to deliver, we've been able to do in a different way. So rather than having a big launch event, we're now doing twilight webinars for teachers. And we're also going to give the clubs a little bit of extra support in how to look after their archive in both a study day and then a webinar of how to look and care for your collections. So that's where we are at the moment. So our next steps, everything needs to be delivered by November, and then we'll have a month of evaluation, and then that will be the end of the project. We've still got some proofing and piloting by schools as and when possible. Our teachers panel are being very helpful, and we have a number of contacts across both Leeds and Bradford area, and we still need to run our twilight webinars. Then we will hopefully, if not at the end of the year, then in the early 2021, upload it so that it's accessible. So we will have an online launch. It will not only sit on the foundation website, there'll be links to it from the Sporting Heritage website, and it will sit on the My Learning site, which I think Kate is going to come on and talk about. And we'll use our network to promote it. So as soon as it's live, I'm sure you will hear about it in the Sporting Heritage newsletter. And then the final thing is for us to sit back and have a reflection on where we think, with our knowledge of what's out there and the knowledge of the curriculum, what could be there for future development, and how that model of working would be best to be rolled out should the foundation wish to work with other clubs across the county. So that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour across the project. Please ask questions when we get to the Q&A session later, and I'll hand back to Kate.
Thank you very much, Fran. I'm going to hand straight back over to Derek. We'll log all the questions if they weren't answered at the rest of Fran's presentation, and we'll come to those in a bit. But I will hand over to Derek to introduce himself properly and give his presentation.
Thank you very much, Fran. Thank you, Kate. This is where you find out that I was the head of a sports college for 20 years. Rather than perhaps the head of a technology college, but hopefully we will be able to share screens appropriately. Here we go. Hopefully you'll see that in a moment. Hope there's a virtual thumbs up on that you can see my screen. It's a huge in context pleasure and privilege to be able to present this afternoon on I think areas where the sporting past and stories can really inspire through this most challenging of periods. If any of you were in the last two of the conferences, you'll have known that I would have been presenting as a serving head teacher. I was head of Parkhouse School for 20 years. My educational vision was sometimes questioned, but I like to think I saw this September coming. And since then, I've been working as an educational consultant on a range of projects, but very proudly the education ambassador for Sporting Heritage. But whatever has changed in that intervening period, I still go back to my own sporting youth, my own sporting past. That's me, believe it or not, at the age of 14, at the end of the Southern Boys Cross Country Championships at Parliament Hill. And I think my passion for sport and history, and I was once upon a time a history teacher, really goes back to being rooted in the difference that sport, physical activity and the wider learning from it had on me as a young person. So that's just a little bit by way of context. What I want to do in this sort of 10 minutes or so is to reflect on three projects that I've been involved in and led and helped to coordinate since March, when I was still a serving head teacher. Our lives are governed by the rules of certain numbers, aren't they, at the moment? I like to stick to three for this one. The three programmes, 1404 High Performance with Paralympic gold medalist Danny Crates, the Performance Under Pressure and Best Version of Me programmes with Welsh rugby legend Phil Davis. Both of those two programmes actually starting and developing out of adult learning context, but also being applied in the school context. And finally, the 321 Inspiration programme that I've been developing in conjunction with the Qatar Museum of Sport and Olympic History and their active heroes. So I just really want to go through each of those, but I think there's a common denominator, a common thing in each one of those areas, and that's the educational power of sporting stories and past. And I think we heard that, didn't we, with Sarah this morning, to inspire resilient, resourceful and empowered young people for the present, this challenging present, but also the positive futures that lie ahead. And that's, I think, the common theme. So let me pick up just briefly on each one of those programmes. The 1404 High Performance programme, set up by Danny Crates and actually his partner, Andy Cohen-Ray, fascinating colleague who's actually a high performance director at Mercedes McLaren. You might well pick up on why 1404 performance. If you look closely at that picture, there's actually in the background a clue to it. That was a commercial setup really around how businesses can develop their culture, their language, their spirit, their ethos around stories. And Danny's story was absolutely at the heart of that. At the age of 21, Danny was a county standard rugby player, a winger in Essex. Like many 21-year-olds, he decided he was going to travel abroad and went to Australia. And within the first week, had a horrific car crash, which resulted in the loss of his arm. He reflects on that and says his road to recovery was initially shaped by Jack Daniels, but after that, he decided he would refocus with a purpose through sport and would reinvent himself to become, as he did, the very best Paralympic athlete in the world, the only athlete at a particular time to be world champion, Olympic champion, and world record holder for his classification T35 men's at 800 metres, where he won the gold medal wearing 1404 as the number, hence 1404 performance, in Athens in 2004, going on to become the flag bearer in Beijing in 2008. Danny's story inspires that model. I started working with him in schools in real time. That's actually back in 2009, where what we began was a developmental personal development program, the Best Version of Me program, where he shared his thinking, the older students that you can see filming there are media students, where we produced a documentary thinking about how Danny's spirit and approaches could be applied to learning in a systematic way, breaking down the steps. How are you going to be better at what you want to do, learning from his story? So we've developed that and now put that online so that schools can access it. We've also produced a leadership development program for teachers that draw some of the learning. Again, it's all available in an easily accessible chunked format so that schools can access it as part of their personal development program, or in a revised version, teachers can actually access it as part of their professional development. So that's the 1404 program, drawing on Danny's story. I now want to talk about two programs developed in conjunction with Phil Davis. And I believe Matt Jones from the events room might be in the audience here. I can't thank Matt enough for bringing us together, a really inspirational colleague. Please take a look at the events room as well. If you're interested in sporting heritage and history, there's no better source. Phil draws upon 46 caps for Wales, captaining Wales in the 80s and 90s, and subsequently going on to be the coach of the Scarlets, the Cardiff Blues, Leeds Tykes, but then Namibia in the 2015 and 2019 World Cups. He knows what it's like to perform under pressure during tough times. And what Phil and I looked at, first of all, for the Newbury West Berkshire Economic Development Company, who I work with as one of their education and business advisors, to develop a program for webinars, live webinars that we ran during lockdown, where I questioned Phil about some of the challenges that he'd faced during his sporting heritage journey and how we could apply those and think about those in a business leadership context. But also the thinking from that then developed, because that's his plan for Namibian rugby development for the World Cup. It's the best improvement plan I've ever seen in my life. It's utterly brilliant in terms of how it breaks down the roles of individuals within it. And I started to think about that in terms of school improvement planning and how it could improve my work, but also the impact that Phil could have as an inspirational character on young people. So we were able to secure some funding from a local charitable trust and work with Berkshire Youth, the local youth service, over the summer period to do 6 1.5-hour online sessions, the best version of me. What schools were asked to do was to identify 2 young people from each of the local schools. That meant that there were 16 young people on the programme in West Berkshire, who maybe struggling to stay engaged with their schooling, particularly given the challenges of lockdown, but for whom sport was an inspiration. So what we did was to develop a programme based upon, again, Phil's experiences in sport, but to draw out a little bit more the learning from that could motivate and engage some of these quite challenged young people. Phil began to develop what he called the champion mindset. Was this just about self-belief? I was going to have a little video clip of him singing the anthem here, but I'm not going to risk the technology. What sits behind being a champion? And we developed these arguments. I was applying them in an educational context, Phil talking about his journey. There he is, he's singing right away there. You probably can't hear him. And we particularly looked at all the aspects here. We looked particularly at communication skills. Young people in challenging situations can tend to lose it from time to time, can't they? And they escalate the situation, which could actually be de-escalated and turned into a positive outcome. And we looked at some of the infamous moments where things didn't go perhaps as the performer might have intended. We looked here obviously at the famous McEnroe moment, an amazing piece of serendipity here, that actually the umpire at the time was a Dr. Edward James, who happened to be Phil's dentist and was the club dentist at that particular time as well. But we also looked at Zidane and we looked at Beckham, and how reactions to particular sporting contexts can actually lead to unintended outcomes, but then actually turn that more positively. And I'm sure many of you can remember that nail-biting moment, 3 minutes to go in the final test in the Lions-New Zealand series, 15-all. It looked as though the New Zealanders were going to be awarded a penalty, but Sam Warburton's brilliant communication in that context actually managed to convince Platt that the decision could actually not be that of a penalty, but they were going to restart with accidental, it wasn't accidental offside, it was going to be a scrum rather than a penalty, and how his brilliance in that context as a communicator turned things around. And we then moved that forward, and some of you, I don't know if you can see me presenting at the moment, you may have come across a book called Legacy. It's a fascinating book on the All Blacks and their performance over time. It's the red to blue concept, and how you can actually, what you can control, what you can influence and what you can't control, and how you think around that. And we drew out some of the thinking from those lessons. So that was that particular programme. Some of these wonderful reactions from the young people concerned, who stayed with this online programme right throughout the 6 weeks that we were with them, building their self-confidence, building their self-reliance. And we're looking to sustain that programme moving forward. So that was the second programme that we worked on. Finally, and I don't want to make anybody envious, this is the Qatar Museum of the Olympics and Sport in Doha. An absolute privilege to be able to work with them as the museum is set up and developed. They're looking to create continuity before the museum actually opens. It would have been due, obviously, to have started its visitors in this period. We developed something called the 321 Inspiration Programme. 321 Inspiration, all online, saying and talking about the values and spirit of Olympism and how there's a wider community context to that. We used a number of examples to build this, some drawn obviously from the major figures from the sporting past, how values are exemplified through these amazing achievements, whether it was Bannister's achievement, whether it was the story of Hamlin and D'Agostini from 2016. They tripped over each other, if you may recall, in the 5,000 metres, but then won the de Coubertin medal for the way in which they helped each other over the line. But critically, we've also based it upon something called the active heroes. The museum on the 7th floor will have a whole series of exhibitions devoted to ordinary, in inverted commas, Qatari citizens who've done amazing things through their sporting journey and story, whether it's Doha, who has become the first female triathlete in Doha, in Qatar, her story, how it's inspiring others. Or there's Rashid, who from scratch has undertaken to run every one of the Masters marathons. We break their stories down into thinking 3, 2, 1, what can we learn from this? And then 3, 2, 1, go, a school or community-based activity inspired by them. So that programme, I think, has had real resonance. To conclude, and I've realised this has also been very much a canter through, what have those 3 programmes done? I think they've demonstrated how sporting stories and their power can determine great learning in a blended and online fashion, demonstrated the flexibility to motivate a range of audience, and shown how you can sustain energy and commitment during a period of discontinuity and lockdown. And just as a stop press at the moment, I'm developing a leadership programme out of this, thinking about what organisations and schools can learn from great coaches, great performers moving forward in these challenging times. So thank you for the attention to that very rapid presentation. We'll look forward to carrying on the conversation in the Q&A through any of these online mechanisms, and also I very much want to be part of that drop-in session tomorrow during the midpoint in the session. Thanks very much indeed, and I'm going to pass to Katie now, if I can manage to get myself out of this screen share.
Thank you very much, Derek. I'm really interested in the leadership aspect of it and the young people and the role models and things like that. I think we can unpick that in a little bit more detail in a bit. We've seen some questions coming through. Just to answer a couple of those before we go any further, in terms of the digital resources, after this session, we'll collate everything that's been in the chat in terms of resources and everything that Fran and Derek have referenced, and we'll send that out to you so you can have all of those links to explore at your leisure later on. Right, I will now do my canter through and attempt to share my screen. Sorry about that. There we go. You should all be able to see in a minute. Come on. There we go. A blue screen with white writing. Excellent. Fran's nodding at me, so that's really good. This is less sporting based. As Leeds Museums and Galleries, we are the largest local authority museum service in the country. 9 sites, 1.3 million objects. We have sporting collections in the collection, but what I thought would be most useful as a counterpoint to Fran's and to Derek's would be to talk about what we've done in terms of lockdown in the last few months and how we're now moving forward out of COVID, because the world has entirely changed, frankly, over the last few months, hasn't it? So it will be a canter through. Do you remember a time before lockdown when we could get close to each other and actually hold objects? Well, that's great, isn't it? The world has changed quite a lot. In terms of our schools engagement, we see a lot of schools on site, or we did, and now we've moved to digital stuff. But one of the key things that has really helped us during the COVID period is we had a primary schools membership scheme. It has 3 levels, bronze, silver and gold. You get loans boxes with real accessioned museum artifacts and objects in them. You get workshops, and then at the higher levels, you get teacher CPD. It's the teacher CPD that's become really key, and the access to the objects in terms of the link between the blended learning of the digital and the real. We've had lots and lots and lots of conversations as a learning team in the last few months about being a museum service or being something that uses objects and real things, and how we bring that into the digital sphere and how that remains authentic. So hold on to the primary schools membership, it will become important shortly. During lockdown, we, like every other arts and cultural organisation, spun to be digital. You can still see lots on our virtual visit website there, which is part of our main website. We took a very key decision though, right at the start of lockdown, having spoken to some families and some teachers. We made the decision to split those resources in half and have homeschooling curriculum linked provision, and then the nice fluffy crafty family entertain your children type stuff. So you can see there's the museum from home, which is more the curriculum focused stuff. The little piggy on here is actually really strongly literacy based, and then you've got the nice kind of more crafty based things as well. I'll leave you with the links later so you can explore them at your leisure and see how we did and what you did and compare it and everything like that. This is Emily, who's now all over your screen at the moment. Emily is one of the learning officers at the Leeds Museum Discovery Centre, which is our open access store. And just as we were locking up and leaving the building, she said, you know what, I'm going to take all of those boxes for the membership scheme, all those loans boxes home. So she did a video a day for 4.5, 5 months, based on an object a day, building to a theme a week in these museum from home videos. They proved really popular in terms of our membership schools because it was curriculum related content, but also they had quite a good family and adult following. We were posting them on social media and they're all on our YouTube channel as well. Apparently she's going to be on the Steph show next week, is Emily, so she is a rising broadcasting star. As Fran mentioned, there is My Learning Digital, which is behind all of this. This is a teaching resource website we manage as a service, but it is a national resource. So it includes arts and heritage and cultural information, stories from across the country, and we have international traffic across it. Its usage shot up during lockdown, as you'd expect, as teachers are trying to find content. It's certainly shot up in Leeds because we have what's called the Leeds curriculum on there, which is a programme of study based around local studies and local people. Basically, the idea behind it is to give kids roots, to give them wings, but you can teach any subject through it, and it does involve a sporting one. So do have a look at that if you want to. My Learning is there for anybody to put content on. So if you are looking at how you're working out your digital provision, then please have a look at My Learning and get in contact. Our rates are really cheap at £12 a year to host anything and pay for 5 years up front at £60. That's my selling point, and there we go. So what are we doing now? Well, now we've done live broadcast CPD into schools with whole school staffs. And we were doing them in person before, so it wasn't too much to switch to Zoom. And we're also doing live broadcast schools workshops, which have involved quite a lot of talk and a lot of organisation behind the scenes, but not as much kit and caboodle or expense as you'd think. So the image on the right of your screen, if you can see it, is our rather Heath Robinson-esque setup at the Discovery Centre, where you've got a child's chair on top of a table, on top of some books, with a tiny little webcam linked to a laptop with a green screen behind you. So it's not expensive. We bought it all from Amazon. I think I've spent somewhere around, and with ring lights, about £90 per member of staff to be able to do this across the service. So it's really not expensive. You just need to be confident and comfortable with tech. So if anyone wants to know or is thinking about doing that, then drop me an email and we can connect you with the right people and have a chat afterwards. The other thing that's been a big part of my summer has been the Spaceful Learning guidance, which I've had a hand in writing. This is done by the Claude Duffield Foundation, GEM, which is the Group for Education in Museums, and Engage, which is the Gallery Educators. And it is a brilliant set of guidance bringing together all the legislation from across the 4 nations about delivering COVID secure activities, whether that's in person, whether that's digital, and it's got case study evidence and everything. You've got the link for it at the bottom, but I would advise you to go and have a look depending on what you're thinking of doing in the next few months. But the key ideas behind it are, if you're going to use anything physically, then there is the 72-hour rule, so you quarantine things. Trying to mitigate those high touch surfaces, whether they are in centres, in objects you're handling, in art materials, in the kind of interactives you see in museums. Think about the environment that you are doing things in, whether that is outside or whatever. And if you're taking it, sorry, this one I borrowed from a museum PowerPoint, if you're removing things from your museum environment, then you need a strategic timetable for reintroduction. We have come so far down the line of cultural learning over the last few years. We don't want those things to be eroded and eaten away. So make sure you know when things are going back in. The digital and blended learning sphere is massive, but obviously online safeguarding also comes to the fore. So we've had lots of conversations, interesting conversations about safeguarding in the last few months, but that is all on the Spaces for Learning side. In terms of blended learning, this is a really key thing for schools going forward about different people mean different things by blended learning. You can have the real and the digital and the home and the school. Now, the Education Endowment Foundation have just done some interesting piece of research about both, all of those 4 things joined together. And actually it says that blended learning gives you better outcomes for children at the end of education. It's a really initial finding, but that's really interesting for us as other providers that aren't in formal education, but are working around the sides of it. So you've probably done some of this already. You might want to talk to your audiences about their comfort levels of coming back through the door, and that digital stuff doesn't have to be live broadcast. You can have films, you can set live briefs, you can have discussions, you can have 20-minute things. Look at your online safeguarding, and you will need to make sure that your staff are comfortable. My team have spent the whole summer practicing on each other about Zoom and how they use it and what happens when the film doesn't work and what happens when this doesn't work. But there are great people doing great stuff out there. So there's some of those case studies too. And there's even more stuff on there. We will send this presentation out to you so you can have a look at all of those. That's my email address and Twitter and stuff, and Emily's if you want to follow her videos because she's about to start them again, and my learnings if you want to follow that. That is another quick canter through, sorry folks, but I'm going to stop the share, bring it back to us, and then have a bit of a discussion for us, but there is lots of time still for you to have your questions, and we really want to answer those. So there we go, back to that. So Derek, I'm really interested, as I said, in this idea of leadership and how you engender that in young people to be able to give them ownership of stuff. Would you like to talk a little bit more about that or give us another example of that? That would be great.
Thank you. We've had a significant number, I guess, of young people's leadership development programs in real time. A lot of those were actually predicated around school games, developing a workforce to host and support those games, but clearly all of that has gone virtual. So these particular programs have taken online elements of existing programs. The one I referenced with Danny, we'd run for a number of years in school. My year 7, first days for my year 7 has always involved the story from an Olympic, a Paralympic athlete, but not just coming in for the single one-off, thinking about how we can build learning from that through the course of the year, and the young people then layering that. So it's been that as an online adaptation. The programme with Phil in particular was around young people who perhaps were being challenged and hadn't been given those opportunities perhaps in the past. And the third programme, and I suppose the common denominator here with a number of programmes that will have run through, and many of you will have experienced programmes like the London 2012 Get Set programme, are predicated on the values and the behaviours that can be applied in a number of contexts. And certainly the one with Qatar is about how we position that then within a personal development programme. So I think one of the key things is not asking schools to do any more, because my goodness me, they've got enough to do and well beyond at the moment, but where can that fit into existing personal development programmes, some will call it other pieces, and sort of add some value there.
Cool, thank you. It is very much, it touches on again what Fran was saying about the social history side of it being the actual side, because it's focused on people. Certainly that's what we try to do through the Leeds curriculum and through my learning, is pull things from that. Fran, you kind of nudged a little bit at the some of the clubs being less willing because they wanted to showcase their success rather than talking about the people. Do you want to explore a bit more about that?
I think it's a question, because we were essentially trying to turn this project around quite quickly, that actually it's that sort of a learning point, that time spent investing in the beginning and unpicking some of those stories that always take longer than you think to get to that nub of the social history. Because yes, all those cup wins and those, you know, amazing batting scores, and this is where my, you know, I've been doing cricket all summer and my cricket knowledge is still not brilliant, so I do apologize if I make some terrible cricket clanger. You know, people who get really high scores or have real achievements within the game for whatever reason are fantastic, but it's that on its own in a learning context is quite dry and quite sterile. You need the context and the richness around it of what was their background, what was the team doing at the time, what did the coach say that was really motivational, which sort of ties into what Derek was talking about. So, and if your main focus has just been playing cricket and running your club, it's just a different way of thinking, and me going in and saying, oh, so have you not got all this fantastic social history stuff? And they look at me as if I've come, you know, from somewhere else. And it's just that we naturally think in that way. They naturally think from a much more statistical point of view, and it's finding that point in the middle where you can actually spend time unpicking those stories, and then they go, oh yeah, but yeah, we have got that, and we've got a letter from somebody, or we've got a photograph, or there's somebody you can go and talk to for an oral history, and that takes time to build up, as much as it takes time for me to understand, you know, if somebody has a score of X amount, that's a fantastic cricket achievement, because quite often people say, oh, this person did this, and I just look blankly at them because that my cricketing knowledge, as I say, is not great, and I don't, within the context of cricket stats, I don't know where that sits, but I know where the social history side is. So we were sort of coming at it from two sides of the same coin, but it's just trying to meet in the middle. And I think it would have been a great benefit for our project if we'd had that little bit longer to tease out some of those great stories. And although we haven't had time to do as much as I think we would have liked to, it's definitely something that the foundation can take on, because the stories are there. They just need the time and the investment to tease them out, and also to encourage the clubs to start collecting that stuff naturally, so that, you know, in 10-15 years time, whatever's happening now, whether it's the impact of COVID or whether it's happens when they go back to playing, I know there's a little bit of club cricket going on this summer, so that they start collecting it more naturally, so that you've got those stories in their sort of entirety rather than just the statistical information.
Cool, thank you. And that move towards motivation actually is what you can then show a behavioural change or an attitudinal change or a long-term change in the young people that you're trying to influence away. Which brings me to Fran. Was there physical activity involved in the project?
We were hoping to, yes. Actually, it's when we came to the event that we were both at the History Forum, back like you say, back in a time where you could actually sit close to people and have 30-40 people in quite a close space. So myself and Kate attended, was it the Northern History Forum? Yes. Yeah. Which is at Leeds Beckett University. That must have been late February, maybe early March, just before the lockdown. And obviously it's a forum where lots of teachers come together and hear about all sorts of things that are going on. And we did come across lots of PE coordinators and who were really interested in how we could match up this sort of social history side, and that was for development. And then unfortunately that's something that's gone by the wayside of this project. But again, there is great potential to do it, and a lot of the resources, that the way that we started putting the resources together and the way that they do work is you can sort of follow some of the resources too. There's one resource that I didn't mention, which is an art resource about building your own, designing your own club logo. So in the Victorian resource, you can set up your own club, then you can design your logo, and then you sort of see it to fruition where you would arrange your own tournament and then play the game. So that's how we were going to sort of link it through, so that they all stand alone, but you could link it through, and then somebody could write the poem for the day, and somebody could keep the stats and do all the mean and median. So, you know, it's all part of a bigger jigsaw if you want it to be. But unfortunately, because the teachers' focus was elsewhere, our access to schools wasn't possible. That's definitely going to go on to the, you know, recommendations for future development from our point of view.
It's certainly that kind of cross-curricular planning and looking at the curriculum as a whole. That's what we do a lot as Leeds Museums and Galleries. It's certainly part of the membership, but now we're getting a bit more of a reputation for it, is going into schools and tweaking and reshaping their curriculums. They have to be happy for us to do so, but actually then you can follow those lines all the way through and go, actually, if you pull that topic here, and how does that relate to what you're doing across your PE curriculum, and can you bring in dance there? How does dance relate to cricket, and how are you bringing in those motivational stories and things like that? I'm guessing, Derek, that's what you tried to do when you were head, isn't it, is pull all of those strands together?
Absolutely so, and it's that thematic working, and it's that's why I referenced the values that they can work right across the curriculum. And we referenced, and I think you were quite right in the beginning of that brilliant presentation to talk about what actually is blended learning. But prior to the blend would have been that bit of historical research. It would have been the creative piece, and then it would have actually been to have played the bit of cricket at the end of it. Would have been the ideal mix, wouldn't it? That would have brought everything together. It's an experiential moment for the young people.
Now, we've had a question in from Isabel before the session started, because hi Isabel, it's like the middle of the night for you, isn't it? Bless you. Well done for sticking with it. I'm really impressed with your determination, which is that you'd love to hear about some positive experiences of tying sports and sporting heritage to the science behind the sports. So again, that talks to that kind of cross-curricular type learning. And I'm going to go over to Derek first, if that's all right.
I'm not sure that this is necessarily an absolutely clear response, but certainly within elements of the science curriculum, whether it's a biology curriculum or whether it's elements of physiology, certainly in GCSE and A-level PE, there will be a lot of work that will take the example of a particular performance and then deconstruct that in the context of the science that sat behind it. It would take that iconic or historic performance that probably did push back a boundary that would address that. Phil, in the sessions that we did, more so, I have to say, with the business leadership group rather than the young people's group, looked a little bit at the work of some of the sports scientists that were working alongside the Namibian side in particular there in terms of preparedness, moving into nutrition as well. And interestingly, we've got a session this evening, in fact, in Berkshire, that's going to be led by Andreas Pistorius, who's another Welsh international rugby player, got a business psychology but also a sports science background, that's going to be talking a little bit about, what does well-being in the workplace look for, drawing on the science of his sporting performance. So it's a bit tangential, that answer. But you're absolutely right, Kate. I mean, it's a key area of cross-curricular work, and I think there's clearly a resonance in those two areas.
Yeah, cool, thank you. We've also had Helen offering support in the chat, so have a look at that, Isabel. The way that we've come across it in terms of being a museum service is one of our programmes is working with SCITs, which are school-centred initial teacher training providers. And we see all 190 trainees from one SCIT. Most of them are secondary. There's quite usually a bunch of PE teachers, and we see them 6 times a year. And actually, the PE teachers engaging with collections has been really interesting. And a few of them have brought back their teams that they work with outside of school or the students inside of school to look specifically at those kind of leadership qualities. But they have also tinkered around the edges of the biology kind of things in the collections about muscle structures and how we differ from animals and how a cheetah moves really fast, that kind of thing. Again, that's a bit tangential. Possibly have been on that to your question, but I hope that goes some way to trying to do with it. We've also had a question in about the lot of interest between diverse heritage through our sporting collections. Obviously, there's been a lot of spotlight on it through Black Lives Matter and things over the summer. Fran, have you come across any diverse stories? I mean, you talked about the Asians and the women's history coming to the fore in the next few months. Would you like to
so there's definitely, there's a huge amount of history to be explored around the Asian communities, I'd say particularly around the Bradford area, and that was something we wanted to look at, how cricket had helped with cultural cohesion and different traditions coming in and how it shaped the games. We're working with one club in particular that has there's essentially a South Asian club, but playing within the traditional leagues as opposed to playing in, there is a separate South Asian league in the Leeds and Bradford area, but this particular club, Great Horton Church, play within the sort of other leagues. But unfortunately, we got sort of halfway through, and there wasn't, from just one club, there just wasn't quite enough to make it into a learning resource. And I must admit, this is where I started to feel a little bit uncomfortable, because as a middle-class white woman, I was not maybe the best person to approach those communities. So we've actually identified somebody else within the Sporting Heritage team who's part of the research programme, who we hope may go and approach the communities and actually try and find go and speak to some of the other clubs so that we pull it together in a different way. So we had our set cohort for the main number of resources, and actually there we need to look at a different cohort of clubs to pull out a much stronger, richer sort of South Asian story. So that's what we're hoping will come out of that second piece of work.
Cool, that sounds really interesting. Thank you very much. Now, I'm really conscious of time, so I'm going to start to wrap it up there. We will go back through the chat, and if there are any questions that we haven't answered or haven't answered us fully, we'll send those out with the links with a written response so that you do get a response. But you can email us and just pester us if you like. So thank you very much for a very lively and interesting discussion. Thank you to our panellists, Derek and Fran. Thank you guys for coming, and remember, 6:30 tonight. Get your cup of tea, get your glass of wine, and there's the quiz and the social. So hopefully see you there at that. Thanks again, and bye folks.